Welcome everyone to this space where we are talking with Hakim Seymer, the administrator of the United Nations Development Program. We will be talking today about the three reports that brings UNDP about fossil fuel subsidies and how that money could be used for social development and the fight against climate change. Thank you, Mr. Hakim, for being with us.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Edwin. Thank you.
Thank you for you. This interview is for GDA groups, 11 of the most important newspapers in Latin America, like O Globo in Brazil, El Universal in Mexico, and El Tiempo in Colombia, where I am working. So let's start talking about which are the key conclusions of the UNDP reports about worldwide fossil fuel subsidies that you bring in UNDP.
Let me begin by mentioning one aspect that perhaps many people don't realize. At the moment, the estimate is that every year we spend $423 billion on fossil fuel subsidies worldwide. That is a very significant amount of money, essentially artificially making the purchase of fossil fuels cheaper. Now, obviously, for many people, that may seem a very attractive option, but the first thing that we must realize is that economists have shown us in many different countries, in many different contexts, that this is not a very efficient way to use taxpayers' money. These subsidies, in a sense, encourage more consumption of fossil fuels, which in a general, particularly for economies that import fossil fuels, is not a good thing. Secondly, they discourage the investment in energy efficiency and in the transition to renewable energy. So this is a second disincentive that, particularly given the climate change challenge, is slowing the world down. And thirdly, it is also what we call in taxation or fiscal policy, a regressive measure, meaning it is the wealthier who benefit the most and not the poor, in whose name often these fossil fuel subsidies are put in place. And therefore, UNDP, in the report Future Investment, a Toolkit for a Fair Energy Pricing Reform, and other reports, is putting a spotlight on this area, because from a development perspective, we believe that this kind of expenditure of public funding, of taxpayers' money, is neither efficient nor helpful, and therefore we need to address it. And yet, as we all know, phasing out fossil fuel subsidies is complicated, it is complex, and it needs to be managed in a very wise and in a stepwise way. And this is where our reports are trying to point to, first of all, the step to identify ways on how to repurpose fossil fuel subsidy reforms, finding ways in which we can do this without making people worse off, but actually economies better off. And secondly, in the next step, also to introduce carbon pricing, which is increasingly going to drive the kind of energy markets of the future.
Talking about climate change, why it is so critical for sustainable development, and how does it affect the Latin American and the Caribbean countries, that is the people that is watching us right now?
Well, I think if you ask, many of your readers, whether in Brazil, in Colombia, in Mexico, or in the Caribbean, we are already witnessing the impacts of climate change. They can be devastating in terms of extreme weather events, whether it is the hurricane seasons that are becoming increasingly dramatic and destructive, whether it is the extraordinary floods that we have seen in recent years in Colombia, in Brazil, and other parts of Latin America. These are, first of all, imposing enormous short-term costs on the economies. And secondly, science has told us again with the IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change this year, that we are heading for a 3, maybe 4-degree world if we continue on the current trajectory. Now, for anybody who lives in South America, imagine for a moment the Amazon ecosystem. This ecosystem, by the estimates of some scientists, would essentially cease to function in the way we know it now, at around 3 to 4 degrees global warming. And for anyone who understands what a central part the Amazon ecosystem plays in the hydrological system of South America, meaning where rain and water flows from rivers into significant parts of South America, keep millions of farmers alive, cities supplied with water, that hydrological pump, so to speak, would possibly not function anymore, with enormous consequences, literally for tens of millions of people. And therefore the impact, and this is something that ECLAC in Santiago de Chile has also estimated, that we could lose 1 to 5% of GDP in Latin America at a 2.5-degree temperature rise. This is an intermediate step. So whichever way you look upon it, climate change is already visibly affecting us. These impacts will grow exponentially. And what we're doing right now in our energy economy globally and in different countries is to slow down the transition to a low carbon, a decarbonized economy. And there the energy sector clearly is a very significant part of Latin America's economies.
So you bring these reports before of COP26. What are you expecting that happens with the presentation of these reports? What do you expect that policymakers of all around the world and mostly Latin America do with this report?
Well, first of all, many people in Latin America have and will see in the next 2 weeks many reports that are showing us and demonstrating how significant the impact of climate change is, how threatening it is to poor people, but also to our urban infrastructure, essentially our built-up environment. What UNDP does best, and this is why we have chosen this focus, is then to say, well, so what can we do about this? How do you practically correct signals in our economy? How do you not only reduce perhaps fossil fuel subsidies, and let me mention here one more figure that is extremely important and actually remarkable. The IMF estimates that the total costs, what economists sometimes call externalities, of these $423 billion of subsidies actually exceed more than $5 trillion in terms of damages and costs to our economies, $5 trillion. So we are looking particularly at how can countries act in a particularly significant part of their economy, the energy sector, address it in practical policy reforms. And here we are talking now about how can each country with its own design, this is very important because every economy is different, every energy sector is different, design a phasing out of fossil fuel subsidies while ensuring that this is done in a social and politically acceptable way. Because what we have seen, and why governments often are very reluctant to do this phasing out of fossil fuels, is that if they're done overnight, if there are no compensatory measures and people are simply worse off, then there will be reactions to it. Remember the rise in public bus fares in Chile, for example, that essentially resulted from an increase in fossil fuel prices. But no measures were taken to say perhaps, well, public transport is particularly what poor people rely on. So maybe we need to differentiate the kind of pricing measures we take in public transport in order to ensure that the increase in fossil fuel costs would not affect them disproportionately. So these are just a couple of examples, and obviously in our work with countries, with governments, ministries of planning, ministries of economy, we are looking for ways in which each country can design the gradual repurposing of fossil fuel subsidies and ultimately use that freed up money. Remember, $423 billion, and invest it in things that help us to transition quicker to a clean energy economy, but also use these funds to, for example, deal with inequality and poverty eradication.
Okay, you, in the reports, the carbon pricing has pros and cons. Which are those pros and cons in Latin America? Because we're talking right now about Chile scenario, and how do you avoid that that's happen again?
First of all, when we have in the past seen these measures taken, what we often forget is that the greatest fluctuations in the price of fossil fuels are not because of particular taxes or subsidies. The fluctuation is actually because of the world market price. And I think sometimes I ask myself, why is it that we accept that when maybe producer countries of oil or exporting countries of gas decide to contract the supply to the world market and essentially double, sometimes even increase prices by more than 100% in a few months, we somehow accept this almost as an act of God. It is a given. But when we're at low fossil fuel prices, we don't accept the notion that perhaps we should find a way in which we should diversify our economy, and with carbon pricing create more resources with which to invest in the expansion of renewables. Now, obviously, again, you asked me, what does it mean to different countries? Well, if you're an oil or gas producing country in Latin America or the Caribbean, then clearly this is a particular challenge because you're looking at a core element of your national economy. But again, is it a good and efficient way to run your economy by essentially selling fossil fuels at a fraction of the world market price? Ultimately, it makes your economy less competitive, even though in the short term, it is a great convenience to have lower petrol or diesel prices. But, you know, to those who are fossil fuel exporting countries, I would say fossil fuel subsidies and fossil fuel exports are not the same thing. One is, if a global market continues to buy the product you're selling, this is legitimate. This is our world market. This is how our trading system works. But it is not the same to then apply at the national level a taxation or a subsidy regime that ultimately benefits usually the wealthiest in our society, because they are the largest consumers of fossil fuels and therefore get the greatest benefit of this taxpayers' money. So introducing a carbon price has two advantages. One, it makes resources more available for investing in the future of an economy's development. Secondly, it frees up resources to focus on the poorer, more vulnerable parts of society, whether it is through social protection, poverty eradication, the health and education sectors, where more taxpayers' money can then be invested. And thirdly, it allows you to also invest in the development of a renewable energy infrastructure. And here, indeed, Latin America, in fact, is in some respects ahead of other parts of the world, partly because of large-scale hydro that has been used, but also in recent years we have seen significant investments in wind power and solar power, ultimately making a national economy also less vulnerable to the global fluctuation of fossil fuel prices. So these are the kinds of elements that a government needs to factor in, and carbon pricing is ultimately the shortcut to achieving a more efficient way in which we price a fuel or fuels that we wish to use less of in the future and enable a cleaner energy economy to emerge, and one that in fact is hopefully also fairer and less unequal.
About that, you propose three use for the fossil fuel subsidies: the poverty alleviation, the provision of income support among vulnerable groups, and the access to COVID-19 vaccines. Which is the best one solution for Latin American countries? Which should be the use of that money in the case of Latin American and the Caribbean countries?
Well, I would begin by saying that it is difficult to generalize across even a region such as Latin America. Let us be honest, the difference in economic infrastructure, in the energy sectors, in also the national economic policies is so divergent that I, and as UNDP, we are always very careful to say, here is a simple formula that you can apply. But I think given that Latin America is probably, and particularly also South America, the continent with often some of the highest inequality rates in the world, I would say poverty eradication would be, and dealing with inequality, for instance, in access to sectors such as education. In many Latin American countries, education is still far too much a privilege rather than a fundamental investment in our children's future that society should finance as a public good. So here, there are very specific measures that can be taken. But let me also acknowledge that in most Latin American countries, urbanization, economic growth will require more electricity generation. So it is vital that some of this financing is also directed towards the expansion of renewable energy infrastructure. And I think we have seen just in recent years how countries have shifted significantly their commitments to actually moving in that direction, including at the recently held high-level dialogue on energy, when a number of Latin American Caribbean countries made significant commitments to increasing the share of renewable energy infrastructure or production as part of their national energy mix. So I think these two are obvious ones. And then, it may also be in the context of the pandemic right now that we could easily justify that we urgently need stimulus packages, that these stimulus packages can in part also be financed over the coming years by phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, allowing us to invest in a more resilient health infrastructure, pandemic preparedness, and ultimately a greener recovery. So it's a policy mix. And each country will have to, I think, in discussions with the public, identify what kind of society and economy they wish to invest in. And I just want to emphasize again, for us in UNDP, the fossil fuel subsidies is one example of what is a relatively low-hanging fruit, and one that in development and economic terms is actually a most obvious one with which to work.
Okay, in the case of Latin America, there is a key point that I remember a lot. That is that the pre-tax subsidies to oil alone could cover 8 times the annual cost of listing the incomes for the poor people in Latin America. What does have to happen that make that a reality?
Well, here we come to two aspects that I think are critical. And one, obviously, the UNDP reports focus on, which is the design of policies, the design of transitions. This is one aspect, and this is, in part a technical, a fiscal, a policy, a planning issue. This is what governments are meant to provide in terms of the regulatory framework for our economies. But the second one is really a political economy issue. Let us be clear. In terms of fossil fuel subsidies, I think if we can assure that the poor are not disproportionately affected, that in fact there are many examples around the world by now where, for instance, a government may phase out fossil fuels, but actually provide a cash grant to poorer households to compensate them for this. It is actually a net positive income measure that we can put in place. Secondly, public transport could be something that we focus on in terms of investing more resources. And I think these are the kinds of debates that go to the core of a society's understanding how dangerous inequality is, how it has really affected societies across South America and also Latin America and the Caribbean as a whole, where you have seen more and more protests, more and more political frustration. This has a lot to do with inequality and a sense of injustice. And what we are trying to do with these reports is really to empower a public and national debate where the facts and the opportunities and the examples also from around the region and beyond Latin America and the Caribbean actually provide examples of how this can be done. So it is a very positive agenda, and it is one that we as UNDP genuinely view as an offer of supporting Latin American, South American countries also in their transitions towards a decarbonized and ultimately greener economy in the future, but not at the expense of leaving too many people behind.
In that first point that you talk, the design of politics, do you expect that COP26 brings all the politics related to climate change that the world needs?
I often say to those who say, we've been having, 26 of these Conference of the Parties, well over 2.5 decades now that we're engaged in this. What we are trying to do right now is almost without precedent. We are trying to, in less than one generation, fundamentally shift the economies of 7.5 billion people onto an entirely new track, namely a decarbonized track where our energy systems, our mobility systems, our agricultural production systems have to fundamentally adjust. And I think sometimes we underestimate the enormity of the challenge. And so what we do every year with the United Nations Framework Convention is to bring all the countries, first of all, into one room, around one, metaphorically speaking, table, and secondly, also into the spotlight, because the only way we're going to make progress is if citizens can see their own governments either being part of the solution or increasingly part of the problem. Because I think there are a few people left, and today we also released the people's poll on climate change that UNDP has conducted. And young people across Latin America are absolutely convinced that we are in a climate emergency now. These are the people who will, soon be the voters. They will be the employees. They will be the consumers, the producers of tomorrow. And they are looking at this global climate process with impatience and frustration, and I think with justification. On the other hand, let us also acknowledge we're about to meet in Glasgow. The Paris Agreement is largely working from the point of view that more than 143 countries have now submitted their national climate strategies with increased ambition levels, which was a fundamental assumption in the Paris Agreement 2015. We are seeing announcements across the world from countries who are looking at significant decarbonization. The net zero commitments, even though I think it is fair to say there are some question marks, how serious are they, are nevertheless now embraced by over 100 countries. So we are moving too slowly. There is no question about it. The time window that we have has shrunk very rapidly. And this is why people are frightened. But what we actually see in the last few years is a significant scaling up of ambition. And I think in many ways we are on a different trajectory than we were even maybe 5 years ago. And to those who don't believe me, think back for a moment if we were having this conversation in October 2019. Would you have believed that we would have 100 countries committed to net zero, that a European Union would mobilize 800 billion euros over the next few years in a Green Deal, similar in the United States, that China has announced a net zero date for 2060, that in India we are now seeing 480 gigawatts of renewable energy infrastructure being built between now and the year 2030. These are major shifts that are happening, and while they don't solve our problem in terms of the time window by the year 2030, by the year 2050 yet, they should also give us some hope. This is the product of citizens across the world becoming involved, challenging their governments, and also challenging a conference like Glasgow. Because without public pressure, without public interest, and without public understanding, we might go on meeting and perhaps not move forward.
Okay, Mr. Akin, I believe that that's all for us. Thank you for everyone to watch this interview, and we hope that you can see all the debates that will be in COP26 about climate change. I don't know if you have anything else to say.
Just to say thank you very much, and I hope that fossil fuel subsidies will become a topic on which all of you will write more in your countries. And for now, muchísimas gracias, muito obrigado.
Thank you very much, Mr. Akin.